The deaf community is one that is sorely misrepresented and misunderstood. Part of this can be attributed to the fact that many hearing people have just never been introduced to the deaf culture properly or at all. While I will be discussing some of the misconceptions that are associated with deaf culture in the media, my main focus relates to the outcomes of these issues. What are the impacts of misrepresentation of deaf culture in the media? So, who or what is this issue affecting? Joyce Kennedy did an analysis where she discussed her research in which she observed strategies that adolescents with hearing loss use in order to seek inclusion within their social environment. What she found was that many deaf adolescents' communication needs suffered, not necessarily because they were deaf, but as a result of misperceptions hearing people have towards deaf people. She found that many adolescents and adults who were hearing believed that deaf adolescents were incapable of communication. This impeded the social integration of deaf adolescents with their peers, as mediums to connect were dependent on incorrect ideals that hearing people have of the deaf community. As a result, many of the deaf adolescents that were observed were left out of social dynamics that were vital to establishing social and interpersonal skills. Moses, Golos, and Holcomb have addressed this issue in one of their articles that highlight on the media's ability to alter misperceptions of individuals of underserved minorities, such as people in the deaf community. In the misrepresentation of deaf people throughout history, there's often a stereotype that depicts deaf people as characters who are lonely, angry, and helpless. They found that these misrepresentations not only contribute to people's misconceptions about deaf people, but they are detrimental to the social health of young deaf adolescents. The authors discuss ideas of a cultural perspective in which society as a whole can benefit from learning the linguistics and background of deaf culture. This concept of cultural perspective has some elements of success in studies where both deaf and children were able to learn new words, story elements, and aspects of deaf culture after 2 or more viewings of educational media. The author also proposed specific ingredients, per se, that would be present in media to contribute to a cultural perspective. They include cultural and linguistic role models and deaf people, creating and studying of educational media from a cultural perspective, research-based strategies and findings, collaboration with deaf people, deaf empowerment, and deaf leadership with hearing allies. Finally, we have research from Sharon Pajka-Wesk, who wrote an interesting article about deaf representation in literary media. In her initial briefing, the author laments how difficult it actually was to even locate literature that depicted deaf characters, as the resource is extremely limited. What was interesting out of the available media is that deaf characters depicted by hearing authors actually adopted more of a cultural perspective than the characters of authors who were deaf. Pajka-Wesk believed that this could be attributed to deaf authors growing up in a greater pathological environment that impeded their social and psychological perspective. On a positive note, the author also found that recent books written by hearing authors are far more realistic to the depiction of deaf culture than books that were written by hearing authors decades before. So what does this mean for the readers? In her article, Pajka-Wesk concludes that a majority of the books, particularly for young adults, provided a solid context for readers to grow an awareness of the diverse range of lifestyles that deaf individuals have. Overall, Pajka-Wesk assessed that accurate representation of the deaf community is increasing due to a growing representation of deaf culture in media and research, which gives a more rounded perspective for accurate portrayal. We can see this in modern media, such as the show Switched at Birth, which aired on ABC Family for 5 seasons. A main character is deaf, and her struggles to assimilate into a hearing family in social settings raises awareness of deaf culture and society's tolerance of difference. In review of our research question, what are the impacts of misrepresentation of deaf culture in media? We can see that misconceptions about deaf culture do have a negative impact on the social integration of deaf adolescents. Additionally, we can see a link between misrepresentation of deaf people in the media and the forming of misconceptions in hearing adolescents and adults. This gives us the indication that inaccurate portrayal of deaf individuals in media will have a negative impact on the ideals that people form towards the deaf community, starting at a young age. We can also see that the more realistic representations of deaf culture has led to an increase of overall representation in a broader range of media communication. And finally, we can see that having accurate portrayals of deaf people in media do have positive impacts on the re-education of adolescents and misconceptions that they have associated with people in the deaf community. This leads me to conclude that having an increase in accurate representation of deaf culture across a broader scope of media platforms will likely have a significant impact on breaking stereotypes associated with deaf people to aid in building healthier, more realistic concepts of this cultural community.